Colonel Malcolm Weatherby, reporting from Ocotillo, California. And today, we're going to learn about firearms.
The origin of firearms began with the invention of gunpowder. Initially, gunpowder-based warfare solutions were merely a spectacular show of fireworks, which you could imagine had a great effect on your opponent's psychology. A later design, called a fire lance, was used in the 12th century and was much like a flamethrower on a pole. Early records show that the first true firearm was said to be used in the late 13th century by the Yuan dynasty. This device was essentially a hand cannon that includes the three basic elements of a firearm. This technology eventually made its way into Europe, and the design of the hand cannon was modified into larger versions, creating some of the first field artillery units. In 1608, some of the first flintlock rifles were issued to foot units, thus forming the first infantry groups to be used in combat. The design and function of the flintlock weapons had few changes until 1865, when the Springfield Armory introduced some of the first breech-loading rifles. Firearms began to develop faster loading mechanisms that gave rise to what we recognize as modern-day firearms. How do these bloody things work, by the way? All firearms use the same principle of using a chemical process by introducing heat to transform a solid into a gas. This expanding gas builds pressure inside the barrel that forces the projectile out at high velocities. Let's talk about these different loading systems. The first loading system that was developed was muzzle loading. Muzzle loading firearms require that you insert the gunpowder down the front of the barrel, then followed by the projectile. These muzzle-loading firearms were ignited by a flintlock mechanism, where a small piece of flint is attached to a hammer that strikes a metal piece called a frizzen, that creates a spark and ignites the gunpowder in a bowl called a flash pan. This style of ignition and load was standard until the development of the ignition cap, which uses a hammer that strikes a cap that ignites the gunpowder. The next advancement in firearm technology was the breech-loading firearm. Breech-loading firearms are a bit more complicated and have several methods of ignition and loading of the projectile. Breech-loading firearms load first the projectile and then the powder from the rear of the weapon system. Most breech-loading firearms use a cartridge that contains the gunpowder and projectile. Here are some visual examples of breech-loading firearms. Modern artillery, lever-action rifles, shotguns, bolt-action rifles, auto-loading rifles. Some of these are magazine-fed, belt-fed, and drum-fed.
And this is an example of a revolver, one of the two types of pistols that are available. And a revolver, the ammunition is stored in a cylinder.
This is an example of an auto-loading pistol. If you decide to use firearms, remember these 4 simple rules. Always keep your finger off the trigger until you're prepared to discharge your firearm. Never point your gun at anything you do not intend to destroy. Know your target and beyond. Always treat a firearm as if it was loaded.
And remember, always wear eye protection.
And don't forget about ear protection, because firearms are loud.
God save the Queen!